All right.
Good. Okay, we're good to go, Chairman, whenever you're ready.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nicole. I will call this meeting to order at 6:03 p.m. Have there been any requests for excused absences?
Hey, Jamie. Never mind. I have not received any.
All right. We'll move on to the Pledge of Allegiance. Vice Chair Cooley, will you lead us in the pledge?
I pledge allegiance to the flag
the United States of America,
America.
to the
to the republic for which it stands,
Which stands
one
nation
nation,
under God,
God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
justice for all. Are there any requests for adjustments to the agenda? There do not appear to be any. Are there any conflict of interest disclosures to be made? Go ahead.
Just make a motion to approve the minutes as presented.
All right, we need to move through the first few items before we get to that. So is there any conflict of interest disclosures? All right, hearing none. Nicole, are there any public comments?
I have no written comments. Jeff, do you have anyone on the line?
No, there's no one on the line.
All right. All right, now to the approval of the minutes.
I think we need a roll call.
Thank you. Nicole, could you please do the roll call?
Yes. Alternate member Damian Butler. I don't see him here.
Present.
Okay, thank you. Alternate member David Vanderpool.
Here.
Member Keith Bacon.
Here.
Chairman Thomas Lemasters.
Here.
Member Frank Parks.
Here.
Vice Chairman Steve Cooley.
Here.
Treasurer Baron Janetti.
Here.
Councilmember David Fenn.
Here.
Councilmember Julio Martinez.
Here.
Thank you, Nicole. Now the approval of the minutes. Has everyone had an opportunity to review?
Yes, Chair, can I make a quick comment?
Please.
Yes, I just want to state for the record that although I was absent during the special session, I did review the video of the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Martinez.
I move we.
Is there a motion to?
I move that we approve the minutes of our last meeting, or is that the special meeting?
Can we approve both at once, Nicole?
I'm sorry?
Do we need to approve separately?
No, you can.
Do we need to approve the minutes for each meeting separately?
You can approve together.
Okay.
So I move that we approve both the regular meeting and the special meeting.
Second.
Is there a second?
Parks, and I'll do a quick.
Nicole, please call the roll.
Okay. Member Bacon.
Yes.
Member Parks.
Yes.
Vice Chair Cooley.
Yes.
Chairman Lemasters.
Yes.
Treasurer Janetti.
Yes.
Councilmember Fenn.
Yes.
Councilmember Martinez.
Yes.
Motion carries. The next item on the agenda is recommendation of public trust for investment advisor services with a presentation by Finance Director Mullenkamp. Mr. Mullenkamp, you have
Thank you,
the
Mr.
floor.
Chair, members of the committee. Actually, I'm going to turn this over to Jennifer Station. She she really carried all the all the heavy lifting on this item, and it's really her work that got us to here. So Jennifer, I'll turn it over to you to take them through what we're doing tonight.
Thanks, Jeff. Good evening, Finance Committee members. On September 15th, City Council adopted and revised investment policy, and at that time, the use of investment advisor for portfolio management was discussed to provide the city with professional advice on investment selection. The guiding principles of the investment policy are safety, liquidity, and obtaining a market rate of return. And at that time, it was determined that the use of investment advisor would be beneficial to assist the city in meeting these goals. And on November 9th, the Finance Committee formed a selection committee to develop and issue an RFP for investment advisor selection, and then to return to the Finance Committee with a recommendation of an advisor to take to council for contract approval. After issuing the RFP, the city received 8 proposals. The proposals were reviewed for ability to meet service requirement, understanding the needs and requirements of the city, scope and services offered, experience, qualifications, and knowledge of key personnel, reference for similar work completed, proposed pricing, and completeness of responses to the RFP. The selection committee reviewed all proposals and individually scored them to come up with the top 3 to interview. Now, the selection committee interviewed 3 qualifying firms, and the selection committee then independently scored the interviewees based on presentation, experience in California local government, and their fee structure. All 3 firms that we interviewed were a good choice. But the top score went to Public Trust, who is a firm that is 100% committed to the public sector and has previous experience with entities similar to ours. Now, they will assist the city with review of our investment policy, assist with cash flow analysis, semi-discretionary investment strategy, and GASB compliant reporting. So Public Trust is here this evening to introduce themselves and let you know more about their firm. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and pass it off to Tom Tite with Public Trust.
Thank you, Jennifer, and good evening, everyone. We have a brief presentation to walk through. It was the part of the presentation that we presented to the selection committee a week or 2 ago, just to let you better get to know Public Trust advisors and our relationship, what our relationship would look like with the city of Beaumont. Mark, I think you're controlling the presentation, so maybe you can fast forward to slide 3 for me, if that's okay. There we go. Sorry, there seems to be a slight delay here. Mark, can you hear me?
Yeah, apologies, Tom. I could not find my unmute button. So let me go ahead and reshare that slide with you guys.
Okay.
I'm unfortunately at the moment unable to find the share my screen button. So I apologize. Bear with me for one moment.
Sure.
Mark, it looks like you're sharing your screen already. We can see your screen. It's just a matter of starting the slide.
Yeah, it's in.
Okay, maybe it is minimized then in the wrong window. So let's see.
There we go.
Being a little delayed. Tom, can you just see do you see the panes on the left, or you just see the presentation?
Yeah, I can see the panes on the left.
Okay, then let me try to get into presentation mode.
Mark, if you just want to click in the,
Okay, get it started from here.
yeah, could maybe just go to slide 3 out of perspective of time. Well, good evening, committee, and thank you again for the time. Mark and I made this a portion of this presentation to Jeff and Jennifer a few weeks ago, and we wanted to let you introduce you to Public Trust and then let you know a little bit how this relationship would work. But first and foremost, about Public Trust Advisors, we're a SEC registered investment advisor headquartered in Denver, Colorado. We have an office in Los Angeles, which is where the relationship with the city of Beaumont would be managed out of. Public Trust has a single business focus, and that's providing investment management and advisory services to government and institutional investors, just like the city of Beaumont. So we do one thing and one thing only, and that's provide investment management and advisory services to clients that are focused on safety and liquidity and yield, which is the objectives outlined in your investment policy. The other thing that I think was attractive to Jeff and Jennifer and what we've done for our clients is we provide a truly customized approach. In the coming weeks, if we're fortunate to be selected, we're going to roll up our sleeves and get to know the city's cash flow profile. We're going to work with the city on taking a look at your investment policy, making recommendations, and then forming a plan and then implementing that plan once we have a good idea of what the city's cash flow profile is, as well as what the risk profile is of both the staff and the city. And we'll implement that into the strategy. As I mentioned, we take a safety first investment philosophy. We have a deeply experienced team. Both Mark and myself have been managing portfolios in California for over 20 years, so we're very familiar with California investment code. And we currently manage assets for over $48 billion for clients' assets across the country. As I mentioned, we're based in Los Angeles, but we have a presence nationwide. We manage funds for clients in 16 different states, and we have 9 offices nationally. Maybe more, go to the next slide if you don't mind. As I mentioned, currently Public Trust has just shy of $50 billion in assets under management. This slide shows the consistent growth that we've had over the past few years. And I'd say what the main reason for that growth, and if you talk to our clients, is our dedication to the public sector, is our willingness to customize an individual strategy for each client. This is not a cookie cutter approach. Every client is different. Every client has a different policy. Every client has different cash flows. Every client has different risk tolerances. So I think if you asked our clients why they choose Public Trust, it's our ability to customize a solution to their individual situation. Tonight you're speaking with both myself, Tom Tite, who's been in the business for 24 years, and Mark Krieger, who would be the day-to-day portfolio manager for this relationship, who's been managing funds in California for 23 years. I think the benefit of this slide is also to show you that it's not just going to be a relationship with Mark and myself. We give the city access to our entire team, our credit research team, in a relationship like this, where there's corporate credit potentially involved and municipal credit, which you're allowed to invest in. Credit research is very important to what we do on a day-to-day basis, and both the finance staff and the city will have access to our credit research team, as well as our compliance reporting and operations team. Jennifer had mentioned that we don't just view ourselves as a portfolio manager, we view ourselves as an extension of your finance staff. So in addition to providing advisory services, we're also going to provide credit research and significant reporting services as well. Mark, on the next slide. If you look to the right, a list of the clients that we serve here in California. As I mentioned early on, both Mark and myself have been working with California clients for over 20 years. We're very familiar with California code. We have a number of California clients that are very similar to the city of Beaumont and what your objectives are in your investment policy. And I can't go without saying one of the most important things that we bring to the table is our ability to customize a unique solution to your individual needs and wants. This is not a cookie cutter approach by any means, but we're going to get to know you, get to know your risk tolerances, and build out a solution that's going to work for the city of Beaumont. Mark, maybe go to the next slide in sense of time. One other thing I wanted to go through is explain the type of relationship before I turn it over to Mark. It was important when we responded to this RFP and in our presentation with the city does want to have what they've determined as a semi-discretionary relationship where the city would be informed of the strategy before any trades are executed. That's how we work with many of our clients. So we wanted to give the committee an idea of exactly how that relationship works. So if you look at this graphic here, you see the custody account. The city will be establishing a custody account with a well-known custody bank. We're working with the city and getting that established. Once that account is established, Public Trust would work with the custodian in a manner that we're granted read-only access, so we are allowed to look into and monitor the custody account. And we will work with the custody provider, the custody bank, on trade settlement and trade execution services. In addition, our online reporting platform would have read-only access to the custody provider, which allows our platform to provide up-to-the-date portfolio information to the city, information such as the returns, the yields, the portfolio characteristics, the ratings of all the securities in the portfolio. Just to be clear, we would not have access to the funds in the custody account. So once we worked with the city to determine how much money that may be invested in LAIF where you're currently invested, and potentially how much money we would actively invest, those funds would be held in the custody account. Just to reiterate, we would not have access to those funds. We would only be able to look into the account, direct the custodian in terms of trades and so forth. The city would be the only person that would have access to the funds and be able to move money in and out of the account. And Mark, you may want to comment on that as well as portfolio manager.
Yeah, no, Tom, I think that's the one thing I might have to add that, as you noted, it's non-discretionary, which means in addition to the role that the third-party custodian bank holds in holding the assets, the city would also provide pre-approval prior to any trade execution. So part of our process, as we'll talk to in a moment, would be kind of establishing the strategy, the risk tolerances of the city, and then beginning the portfolio construction and trading process. Throughout that entire process, prior to any securities being purchased, we would have conversations with city staff and obtain their approval prior to trade execution.
Well, Mark, I think I'll turn it over to you to talk about our approach.
Okay, sounds good. And thank you, Tom. And my apologies for the technical difficulties earlier on. But good evening, Finance Committee members and Jeff and Jennifer. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you tonight. As Tom mentioned, my name is Mark Krieger. I'm a director and senior portfolio manager with Public Trust. And if we were fortunate enough to be confirmed by this committee, I would serve as the day-to-day portfolio manager on the city's portfolio. I want to provide just a kind of a high level and brief overview of our general approach to public funds investment management. As Tom mentioned, that is our sole focus as a firm. That is my sole focus over the past 24 years in California and nationwide. And the one thing I would start by saying is drawing a distinction between the city's current approach to managing its operating portfolio versus the more active strategy with the assistance of a professional advisor that the city is considering. As you all are aware, the city presently utilizes the State of California Local Agency Investment Fund, or LAIF, that is managed by the State Treasurer's Office. And LAIF is, in effect, a short-term local government investment pool. It provides effectively daily liquidity at par for balances held on behalf of the city in the portfolio or invested on behalf of the portfolio. But as noted, it is generally a liquidity product. It is a short-term portfolio designed to provide exposure to very short-term interest rates. And in general, historically speaking, the yield curve, or the relationship between investment maturity and the yield that is earned on that investment, is positively sloping, meaning there is greater income and yield potential for moderate extensions of investment maturity. And so when we look at the performance of LAIF historically versus other very conservative but slightly longer maturity strategies, there is a significant return and earnings benefit available in those longer term strategies. As Tom mentioned, we do take a safety first approach to the portfolio management process. As I'll emphasize throughout my remarks today, we do engage in what we call kind of an actively managed portfolio philosophy and strategy, which means we are periodically rebalancing the portfolio, changing its maturity structure, the composition of the investments, its exposures to different eligible asset classes that may be invested per your policy and that may be deemed appropriate. And that is based, again, upon the relationship of incremental income over government guaranteed securities relative to the perceived amount of incremental risk taken on the part of that investment. So that is something that evolves over time. We employ a dynamic approach that shifts the portfolio's allocation to take advantage of those relative value opportunities, but most importantly, to protect the portfolio principal. So here, as Tom mentioned, it is a customized strategy. Very briefly, our relationship with the city would begin with a kind of an in-depth review of the current program. We know the city currently utilizes LAIF, but foundational to this part of the approach is determining that cash flow schedule, the expected revenues and expenditures on behalf of the city. And the purpose of that is for us to be able to separate the city's portfolio into a liquidity component, which is sized and scaled based upon anticipated cash flow needs over the coming fiscal year, as well as some contingent additional balances for unexpected either revenue shortfalls or unanticipated expenses that may arise over the course of the year. The balance of the portfolio that is not needed for liquidity purposes is what we call the core portfolio. And so that's the portion of the portfolio that we can comfortably, within your risk tolerances, invest a little bit longer on the yield curve in pursuit of those higher yields, that higher income that is available with those slightly longer maturity investments. So the cash flow analysis really gives us the ability to appropriately size each of those components of the overall portfolio. And then, as Tom mentioned, again, this is non-discretionary. So both collaborating with the city and developing the investment strategy, providing the city staff with a model portfolio for review, discussion, to give a sense of the approach and the strategy on the portfolio, and of course then obtaining their prior approval prior to beginning the portfolio implementation or construction process and trade execution process. And then importantly, part of our process requires pre-trade approval. So what that means is we have a trade order management system within the firm, and effectively all of the city's investment policy parameters would be loaded into that system. Any trade prior to execution would go through a pre-trade compliance screen, which means the system scans the characteristics of the security, its impact on the overall portfolio, and confirms that the trade would not breach any compliance limitations within the city's portfolio. That then compliance review happens periodically throughout the day, and then again at the end of the day, and then is further supplemented by our month-end compliance reporting process and the online access to the account that city staff would have. And then this process, in effect, repeats itself every year, where we have an ongoing dialogue with the city, changes in market conditions that may warrant a change in strategy, changes in the city's circumstances that might necessitate a review of the strategy, and are conducted, periodically throughout the year. And formally once a year, we review any changes to investment policy as recommended by the State Treasurer's Office, the GFOA, or industry best practices. Here, I'll just touch briefly upon this, but in general, the investment policy is a critical document because it not only establishes the legal and regulatory framework for the investment program, but it also establishes formally the city's objectives and risk tolerances. And so as part of our onboarding process, as we refer to it internally, one of the first things we would do would be to work with staff to review the investment policy for any changes based upon industry best practices. Around this time every year, the State Treasurer's Office does release an update to their local government investment guidelines, which incorporate any changes to the California state statutes to affect the investment of public funds within the state. So we'd want to make sure that any of those updates were incorporated into the city's document, and then any other best practices recommendations that we might have given our developing understanding of the city's risk tolerances and investment objectives. Here, I've touched upon this, and this is, again, just a graphical representation of the cash flow analysis process that we would go through with the city, with the intent, again, of just separating that portfolio into the liquidity sleeve and the longer duration core portfolio. And again, making sure that those constituent components of the portfolio are appropriately sized based upon the city's risk tolerances. And this is something that we could either get very granular with the city in terms of reviewing historical fund activity, or based upon a more high level assessment of expected monthly revenues versus expenditures. So again, if selected, this is an area along with the investment policy that would be spending quite a bit of time upfront with the city to make sure that the strategy was truly reflective and scaled to its unique circumstances and characteristics. The remainder of my remarks are going to focus a little bit here on that core portion of the portfolio. And so, I noted the city's current approach being a more passive strategy focused on the local agency investment fund here in California, LAIF. And so what we've presented here is a historical risk reward analysis of very commonly used investment strategies for public agencies, both in the state of California and across the country. And in effect, I'll just walk you through as an illustration. The second line item sets forth the historical 20-year average annual return for the state of California local agency investment fund. And you can see that over the past 20 years, per year, the LAIF, which I'll refer to it as going forward, has provided an average annual return of 1.86%. Again, LAIF is a very short-term product, invested very short-term on the yield curve. It has an average maturity of around 180 days, or just around a half a year. So it's designed to provide exposure to short-term interest rates and significant liquidity for invested balances. But that liquidity has come at the opportunity cost of higher interest earnings that may be available in slightly longer maturity strategies. And so I'll just draw your attention to the next line item down, which is the Bank of America Merrill Lynch 1 to 3 year Treasury Agency Index. It is a commonly used market benchmark for public funds, again, both in California and across the country. A very significant portion of our clients utilize this as a benchmark for their underlying core portfolio investment strategy. And so one of the things I wanted to highlight is if we just draw our attention again to that blue shaded region, the average annual return, you can see that again, per year, over the last 20 years, just that moderate extension from roughly 6 months in LAIF into, in effect, a government-only, short duration portfolio with an average maturity of around 1.8, 1.9 years, has provided almost 1% or 0.9% pickup in the average annual return per year over the last 20 years. Now, in exchange for that incremental return, of course, as we move out the yield curve, that means that the underlying investments, the portfolio itself, becomes more sensitive to changes in interest rates. So as interest rates decline, the value of securities held in the portfolio will increase. And conversely, as interest rates were to rise, the value of the securities in the portfolio would decline. And so the first column, effective duration, tells us, how sensitive that portfolio is to changing interest rates. So using the 1 to 3 year Treasury Agency Index, that effective duration of 1.84 tells us that if interest rates were to change by a full percentage point immediately overnight, then the value of the securities in the portfolio would decline or would change by an unrealized 1.84%. So, we look at the volatility that we see in the equity markets, right? And, then we start to scale back into what that 8.4% really kind of tells us. It is still a very conservative investment strategy from a market price sensitivity and volatility perspective. In fact, it takes a 1% change in interest rates overnight to cause its value to change by just 1.84% on an unrealized basis. And of course, so long as the city never had to draw upon any of the funds held in that longer term core portfolio because liquidity was satisfied elsewhere, then it has the time horizon, right, to ride out the potential ups and downs of those unrealized changes in interest rates. So that's the interplay between looking to pursue these higher returns that are available in longer term investment strategies over time, and being able to tolerate the ups and downs, unrealized market value fluctuations that occur as we move incrementally a little bit further out on the yield curve. And so, we'll kind of come back to this concept a little bit later. But again, the other point I wanted to conclude the slide on is that when we look at LAIF as managed by the State Treasurer's Office, it has about a 25% allocation to credit to corporate credit in the form of either commercial paper, which are short-term, corporate obligations issued by corporations, as well as unsecured negotiable certificates of deposit or banknotes issued by U.S. commercial banks. So it has roughly a 25% or so allocation to short-term corporate credit. And so what we wanted to highlight in that comment is that as we move out of that shorter term portfolio that has that allocation to corporate credit, even transitioning into a more secure government only investment strategy comprised of U.S. Treasuries and U.S. agency securities, U.S. agency securities being things like Federal Home Loan Bank, Federal Farm Credit Bank, Federal Home Loan Mortgage Corporation, et cetera, that even as we move out into just the government space, it's that extension of investment maturity that provides the biggest incremental benefit from a return perspective. And here again, just a reemphasis of kind of where the city is currently invested on kind of the risk return spectrum. So again, here in the shorter term portion of the curve, money market funds, state of California local agency investment fund, typically 1 year or under. Enhanced cash would be anywhere between 1 to 1.5 years. And then we start to move out into this 1 to 3 year kind of space where average maturity gets out close to around 2 years on average. And then again, with the expectation of exposure to those longer term interest rates over time throughout market cycles going to benefit the city in terms of greater income by exposure to higher yields and also greater returns over time. Here again, our approach, the one thing I would say, as Tom noted, there's still a lot of work for us to do along with the city in determining its risk tolerances. So our portfolio management process, as I noted, it is dynamic. It works very closely with our credit team to the extent that the ultimate strategy decided on by the city does determine to be appropriate to include some exposure to non-government securities like corporate bonds, municipal bonds, other asset-backed securities. We have a completely independent and dedicated credit team, which independently evaluates the credit quality of all counterparties on our approved issuer list. So that means that anything that is not a government security has to be pre-vetted by our independent, completely separate credit team prior to inclusion in a client's portfolio. And that's an important distinction that we believe our credit team is not portfolio managers. They are not responsible for the management of portfolios. Their sole responsibility is internal credit due diligence on our approved issuer list. Here just a brief couple of comments on that active approach that I mentioned. It's really designed to manage the portfolio's exposure to risk factors over time. And so when we start to dissect the drivers of return in short duration fixed income markets, a couple of things historically stand out as being the primary determinants of return. The most important of which is the portfolio duration, or roughly its average maturity. That's that extension out from LAIF around 0.5 years or 6 months out to, in my example, the 1 to 3 year strategy with an average duration of 1.8 or so years. That selection of duration is going to be responsible for probably around 80+% of the city portfolio's overall return. And then over time, some of the incremental things that occur in markets that are going to add incrementally to that return are going to be positioning along the yield curve. So as you can imagine, we could structure a portfolio that has an average maturity of 1.8 years, many different ways. And so, actively monitoring the shape of the yield curve and making kind of tactical decisions on how to emphasize or de-emphasize certain portions of the yield curve based upon expected changes in interest rates is another source of value in the portfolio. Asset allocation, the rotation of portfolio capital between eligible and approved and permitted sectors within the portfolio. So U.S. Treasury securities, U.S. agency securities, potential taxable municipal bonds or corporate bonds issued by U.S. corporations as approved by California State Code. The risk return and yield relationships of those asset classes are evolving, over time dynamically, just like the general level of interest rates. And so part of our risk management and return optimization process is monitoring those yield relationships of approved sectors and making minor adjustments to the portfolio's exposure to make sure that it's always providing the city with an appropriate balance of risk and return throughout a full market cycle. And then lastly, security selection, which is really informed by the bottom-up fundamental research of our independent credit team. And then again, risk management is a theme throughout everything that we do here at Public Trust. Just a couple of brief notes. I know we're running a little bit long, but on just the concept of diversification. Again, as I mentioned, there's still a lot of work for us to do in working with the city in determining its risk tolerances and what an appropriate maturity profile and asset allocation profile ultimately will be. But the only one thing I wanted to say on this slide is that diversification is really a foundational, concept for portfolio management because it illustrates a couple of important points. And that is, as we look at the eligible asset classes that the city is legally allowed to invest in by state statute, it actually provides the opportunity through appropriate diversification to provide less risk and more return. And so, and that's because the return patterns of eligible asset classes are not perfectly correlated. So just a very quick example of that, here we're setting forth the 1 to 3, the top 4 or so line items is the same data that we saw previously on those historical returns, but we're looking at it now from an asset class perspective. And so what I wanted to draw your attention to was, again, the 1 to 3 year Treasury Index, which is US Treasuries only, over the last 20 years, has provided an average annual return of 2.6% with a realized standard deviation, right, the volatility of its returns, of 1.39%. And then fast forward, if we look at the 1 to 3 year corporate index, it has provided an average annual return of 3.54%, so almost a full 1% per year increase, with a slightly greater volatility of 2.31% per year. But that when we combine a blended portfolio that includes 50% treasuries, 30% agencies, and a 20% allocation to corporate credit in this sample portfolio, what it illustrates is that that average annual return compared to a treasury-only portfolio increases by around 25 basis points per year for the last 20 years, but its realized volatility has actually gone down compared to a government-only portfolio. And that's because when the economy is doing poorly, like it did early in 2020 in immediate response to COVID, U.S. Treasuries, U.S. agency bonds perform remarkably well. Corporate credit may underperform for a while given uncertainties about earnings outlooks, et cetera. But that when that outlook turns and the economy begins to operate more normally, expectations for growth and corporate earnings improve, then Treasury bonds underperform with corporate bonds providing superior returns. And those return patterns don't occur at the same time. And so it provides the opportunity to have a diversified exposure to a broader range of asset classes and actually have experienced less volatility than a government-only portfolio. Of course, in this context, an extremely important component of that approach is credit research. And again, importantly, this is not a recommendation. We still have a lot of work to do with the city in determining, appropriate risk tolerances, et cetera. But it's meant to illustrate just the concept and the importance of considering diversification in the portfolio construction and management process. Again, here, risk management, is a consistent theme. One of the things I'll simply say here is we continually review the portfolio's performance versus its selected benchmark. And one of the things that we do using that relative value analysis that I discussed previously is change the portfolio's exposure to different risk factors based upon our perceptions of the relationship between potential risk and return. And so that means actively making slight tactical adjustments within the portfolio that we expect are going to provide additional return to the city's portfolio. But we understand that markets are not guaranteed. And so what we wanted to highlight on this slide is we are actively monitoring the city's performance versus its stated benchmark. If we start to see the portfolio underperforming its selected benchmark, we may either one, maintain those tactical positionings because we still believe in our underlying investment thesis, and we believe that that underperformance is a function of near-term volatility, and then on a going forward basis, there is still value in maintaining those exposures. Alternatively, we do acknowledge that sometimes we don't correctly call every tactical adjustment within the portfolio. And so we will manage those exposures. And if our thesis changes, if the portfolio starts to underperform its index, we will look to make recommendations to potentially rebalance the portfolio away from those tactical adjustments, either in terms of its asset allocation or maturity structuring along the yield curve. If again, that longer term thesis changed. So it is an active process where we're managing risk on an ongoing basis and making recommendations on the portfolio to make sure that that risk is appropriate throughout a full market cycle. Here is just a little bit of a history on our composites. So we do maintain composites in accordance with the Global Investment Performance Presentation Standards, or GIPS. And so here we're looking at our composites for both our 1 to 3 and 1 to 5 year composites, and just looking at that historical track record of those composites over the last 10 years and since their inception. And as is illustrated here, again, we do have a very strong track record of having outperformed the underlying indexes or benchmarks for client portfolios. And I've been speaking for quite a bit. And Tom, do you want to maybe just wrap up here with a couple of concluding comments? I know we're probably running a little bit long, but I think we wanted to kind of emphasize, our approach and philosophy for the committee based upon this being a new, direction for them.
Sure. Yeah. And thank you, Mark. And thank you for your time tonight. I'll just conclude with again, how we anticipate this relationship would work. And it would be highly communicative, as you heard Mark talk about. So early on, we would work with Jeff and Jennifer in getting to know your risk tolerances, getting to know the city's cash flows, and recommending a strategy based on that. And then from an ongoing standpoint, once we implemented that original strategy, we would anticipate at a minimum monthly calls to update the city on how the strategy is progressing, what's going on in the marketplace, any potential changes that we may want to make to the portfolio. In non-COVID times, we encourage that we meet face-to-face on a quarterly basis. So hopefully we can do that, but we certainly would want to talk about meet quarterly at a minimum to see how the strategy worked out during that quarter and what we expect on a go-forward basis, and perhaps make additional recommendations to the strategy that we can implement in the following quarter. And then finally, as I mentioned before, and this is important, both the city would have access to the entire public trust team. We feel that's the best way to implement a sound investment strategy going forward. So with that, I know we took up a little bit more time than we budgeted. We appreciate that. Maybe I'll pass it back to Jennifer, to you, and see if there's any questions that we can answer from you and or the committee.
Thanks, Tom. That was a good presentation. So before we move on, are there any questions from anybody?
I have a quick question. That mentioned semi-discretionary, and then the slide said non-discretionary, and then there was some garble with the verbal I couldn't understand. Can you just quickly review what the difference is, if there is?
Yeah, there's not. It's more just of a nomenclature. I think just the general concept of it being non-discretionary, meaning that before implementing the strategy, we would need to get the city's approval. And then based upon dialogue with the city, that level of non-discretion can be a little bit variable, meaning we could go to them with every single trade and say, this is what we're looking to do. Here's the rationale. Do you agree? Or again, if we're operating within a treasury and agency space, for example, we would have semi-discretion to implement those non-corporate, those non-credit sensitive trades consistent with the agreed upon strategy that was agreed to by the city.
And if you don't mind, I'd like to just augment that with currently the way our investment policy is established is that there's semi-discretion. Okay, it's semi-discretionary in that after we get the initial portfolio agreed upon and we're good on that. Further, as they go forward, any changes that materially impact the liquidity or the risk of the portfolio, they have to pause and stop and approach the city before they make those changes. Right now, we have I think is a 15 and a 25% factors that are built in. Those are something we can obviously work with the committee and the city council, and if there's a desire to modify those levels. But that's the current structure we have in place.
Oh,
I have
great.
a question. Does this agreement allow the city the opportunity to prevent the investment in any particular entity? So if we're rolling along and we have some public kickback or whatever with some of these non-government entities, does the city have the ability to say, no, do not invest in that company, period?
Yes, Steve, that's a great question. The answer is yes, of course. So we have internally what we call our approved issuer list, which means that list has been vetted by our credit team. They're comfortable from a credit perspective. But we do, for many clients, implement ESG or environmental social governance related considerations at the client level. So if there's the committee or members of the public have expressed, certain viewpoints that this committee would like to express in its investment portfolio, those are most definitely constraints that we can incorporate into our recommendations and management of the portfolio.
Okay, right down to as detailed as say, we will never invest in XYZ company.
Yes, I mean, the more
regardless of justifying it to you.
Yeah, 100%. It's your portfolio. We are a non-discretionary advisor. If you tell us stay away from, ExxonMobil, just as an example, because of the fossil fuels, then we code that into our compliance systems and reference it in our client files, and then that credit would never make its way into the city's portfolio.
Great, thank you. They're just odd things that come up that are politically driven, and we need to have that option.
No, we understand completely.
Jennifer, I'd like to just tell the committee that there was representatives, myself particularly, Mr. Giannetti, from time to time as his situation allowed. And I endorse the position of Jeff and Jennifer. And I want you to realize that they did 99% of the work. But I did get to listen to all the presentations, and certainly the presentation that we received from Public Trust stood out, but the others were very good as well. And I think we made our choice primarily because of their experience in California, as well as their competitiveness and their pricing structure. And with that, I want to endorse this position for the committee. And to the committee.
Jeff, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, thank you. If there's no more questions on the slides specifically, then Mark, you can stop sharing your screen.
Thank you, Jeff. And I'm having an issue, as you know, finding where that is.
It's usually right along the bottom in the middle.
Yeah, it normally is, and it's my view has changed. I'm only seeing a panel of the members on the call. I don't have any options for.
Yeah, no problem. I think I'll just
you.
provide a couple of just brief comments and thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff.
I think you guys hear from this presentation the talent and the skills of the people that we've selected, at least to approach the committee with, because they do have obviously a lot of background working with people just like us, and with people with different governmental entities that have similar objectives in mind. So. We did have 3 very strong quality presentations that it was a tough decision, but we did as a committee come together, and each of us individually had Public Trust ranked right at the top. I really appreciated Mark's presentation, because it was really kind of what sold me, and that was the analysis of the different types of investments and different structures, and how you can actually, in some cases, take on less risk and actually get more return. And some of that was pretty impressive to me, the analysis that went on with standard deviation and whatnot. So we have started some preliminary work pending, obviously, the decision here to recommend this in the city council on contracts. And I think that we're in good shape to move forward with that if, in fact, the finance committee and city council choose to move forward. With that, I would be happy to answer any questions from my perspective. And again, Tom and Mark are here to answer any questions that you might have.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to make a comment.
Yes, please, Barry.
Okay. I'd like to emphasize to everybody here, since everybody didn't participate, the amount of work that went into this. And if you heard what Jennifer said, we had 8 people respond to this. And I was part of the selection down to 3 until I had some other difficulties to deal with. It's a great process. It's something that was one of our special assignments from the council about getting involved in the RFP process. And I think it went very, very well. The reports, everything that Frank said, I support from being an outsider for the interview process. But my hat's off to Jennifer and Jeff and Frank for making this happen, because it's a pretty arduous task going from 8, and they all look pretty good on paper when we were doing it, and getting it down to 3 really high caliber companies. And I think this is a pretty firm recommendation to make to the council if they want to decide to go in that direction. Thank you.
I had a quick question.
Thank you, Barry. Yes.
Can you tell me more about the fee schedule? You guys said that you chose it because there's a very competitive fee schedule. I'm trying to look for that, and I looked on one of these pages here, and it doesn't say what that is. Could you guys possibly give me more information about the fees?
And Jennifer, would you take that on providing at least the 3 that we interviewed?
Well, yeah. So with public trust, they go off of a basis point of assets under management.
Okay.
With their fee schedule for the first 50 million, that they are at 5 basis points.
Okay.
Anything over that would be 4.5 basis points.
Okay.
And what they did too is for the first year, because of COVID, they decided to cap their fees at 35,000. So that was, yeah. Some of the other ones we got,
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
well, we got the other 2 that we were looking at. One had a fixed fee. Their fixed fee was for 36,000. And then the other one was in the 8 to 9 basis points on assets under management. So fee was a consideration, but not the number one consideration. We also took California management of cities similar to ours in consideration.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Cool.
Are there any other questions?
Mr. Cooley looks like he has a question.
Yes, I have one. I could go through and dig, but this is so lengthy. What is the term of this contract?
Well, the contract will go before the city council for obviously approval, but the proposal I'm making, if this goes forward tonight, would be 3 years with 1 year, with 2 1-year options to extend. Similar to what we have with our audit and with a number of other contracts.
Right. Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments?
Yeah.
Is there a motion?
Yeah, I'd like to make a motion
Yes.
that we approve, we recommend to the council that they hire public trust.
And I will second.
Motion by Mr. Parks. Is there a
I will second it.
second by Mr. Cooley? Thank you.
I'll do roll call if
Nicole,
you're ready.
please call the roll.
Thank you. Member Bacon?
Yes.
Member Cooley?
Yes.
Vice Chairman, Member Parks?
Yes.
Chairman Lemasters?
Yes.
Treasurer Janetti?
Yes.
Councilmember Fenn?
Yes.
Councilmember Martinez?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate the presentation tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah,
Thank you
Jeff.
very much, everybody. Next item on the agenda is internal control findings update by Finance Director Mullenkamp.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. As you're aware, at our last meeting, the special meeting, we talked about the audit and some of the internal control findings. And at that point in time, I expressed to the committee that I thought really made sense for us to come forward each meeting until such time as it's no longer relevant and give you an update on where we are on the findings. And so in your staff report is essentially that summary. So we had 5 findings, 3 that were new findings from the fiscal year 20 audit, two that were carries over from prior years. And so what I've done is I've just used the format of expressing the entire finding with an update that provides you basically any new information for the committee to digest. And I'm hoping that method will work for you all. That way you can just look for that update and you can see, I mean, after a while, after a few meetings, this might get a little bit redundant. So you can certainly look for those differences and changes, and I'll be providing that to you. Essentially, I'll just walk through them 1 through 5 real quick. And they are numbered, so I'll just, but this is the first cash disbursements, which is 2020-001. And we basically find this to be fully implemented. I want to keep it on for a couple more months to report to you what I'm seeing in the logs so that you can understand that I'm doing that review. If you'd like, I can actually print off the logs and bring them to the committee at some point in time. But we have made the transition over to our budget specialist doing that review. That's happening. They're the only ones that are putting in new vendors or modifying vendors. That is effective as we speak. I have gone through my first month's review and saw that once I made that cut, that activity has only been from that individual. The audit log is a feature that I can adjust even if I wanted to, even though I have administrative rights. It is absolutely locked in as an audit feature. Once someone takes a transaction, that person's fingerprints on that transaction stay in the log. On the second item, we have that mostly, this is on payroll. This is 2020-002, segregation of duties. And this wants to make sure that someone independent of the person who's running payroll is signing off and approving any changes in pay, and that there's an independence of that. So effective back in October, we had the director start signing all of those. They're reviewed by the senior accountant in my shop, which is separate from who manages payroll. And the only reason that I say that's not fully implemented is because the audit feature that is used in our payroll system has not yet been utilized effectively. We need to run that and run it across and check it against and so once that's done, and I've done that for a couple of months, I will consider this one to be fully implemented, and I'll report to you on that piece of it. The third item is 003. Again, this is one of the new findings. And there, the update there is that back in October, when this finding was brought to light to us, the director of administration immediately started signing and approving all personnel action forms, all changes. But we also, in the finding, was a requirement or a recommendation, I should say, that the person receiving the pay change modification and that person's supervisor also sign the form. I checked with my staff who does the review of this every biweekly, and that piece has only recently been implemented. So I want to give this more time because that's part of the recommendation. So we've taken part of the steps, some additional parts of the steps that still need to be taken. The prior year findings, the first one was with regard to business license. And the key there is somebody independent of those who receive business license are doing a reconciliation to verify that the monies received match the monies in the system. And so we have established the reports that are necessary. I have a staff member, and effective the beginning of next month, we will have those reports weekly reconciled. And so I want to keep this on your list until I've got a month or so under my belt, and I can provide a couple of those reconciliations to you so you can see what they look like and how it works. And at that point in time, if the committee's comfortable, I'll take this one off the list at that point. The last one is the overhead allocation. And this is with regard to cost allocation and overhead allocation of indirect costs to grants. This one is going to take some additional work. I mentioned that to the committee and the council. I need to get a cost allocation specialist in here, a contractor in here. Because of the workload with the staff, we're managing a budget now. We've got a lot of projects. I don't think I can get to that until this summer. And so I'll beg for your patience with me. This one will be on for a little while longer, because that is critical as a component of making sure we do this right. Because that cost allocation and the numbers that come from it don't only impact indirect rates for grants, but also all the services that we charge fees for. So we need to make sure we nail that down properly. That's my summary. I know you've heard a lot tonight, and so I'll be happy to answer the questions.
Thank you, Mr. Molenkamp. I do want to say before I open it up to questions on my part, I want to thank you for the follow-up on it. Thank you for making this a regular item in our meetings moving forward. It gives me a great deal of comfort knowing that this is something that could potentially cause some real issues. So thank you for the follow-up and the follow-through on that. Are there any questions or comments?
Mr. Chair, I've got one.
Yes.
So Jeff, thank you very much. I've learned in my business and in church service, return and report's a very good thing. So I think this is great. I do have a question though, in some of the processes to remedy these items, were they recommended by the auditor, or is that something that staff has just put their heads together and figured out this is a good way to solve the problem and have it done? Reason why I'm asking is it subject to a review, and are we doing it the best way possible to fix things?
It's a little bit of both. I think all of the actions we're taking and the ones we still need to take are responsive to the audit recommendations. Some of them are very direct. If you look at our payroll, they're recommending that the person receiving any kind of pay modification and that supervisor sign it. So that's a direct recommendation. They're also recommending that the administrative services director, the administration director, or the finance director also sign off. And so those are some very direct recommendations. In the case of the business license, they're recommending a reconciliation take place. They didn't really specify who should do that reconciliation and how often. So some of these things are more how we're doing it, or a little bit more our process to respond to their findings, but not directly. They didn't say, we think this person in that shop should do that reconciliation, just someone independent.
Okay, and then with that, in reference to number 5, the overhead cost allocation, that's the additional homework, then you feel that probably needs to be done to make sure it's done right?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the last part of that.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking, trying to think about number 5 with the cost allocation, your comments about the extra work that needs to go into that. Anytime CFD comes up, my ears perk, being a real estate broker and so forth, and just making sure that, and with the past problems with the city, that make sure everything's done right, that we just don't run into another problem where we get tagged on an audit where we thought we were doing it right, get hit again, and so forth. It's just an opportunity to, I don't know, get it right the first time.
Yeah,
is the best way to put it.
No, you're spot on with that. I mean, in that one, if you look at the recommendation that's actually in there, it's, not just before management response. They actually are recommending a full cost allocation study, and that we bring in somebody from the outside to do it. It is a complicated area. It's not that we couldn't do it as a city, but I would have to take staff off of paying bills, and I don't really have the time. I think they would get angry if we didn't pay bills. So this is one of those where it's actually the recommendation, and it's standard industry practice where you bring an outside party in to help with these kinds of projects. As far as the gap in time, I respect and appreciate your concern. On this one, I did feel like there was a little bit more time, because it's an internal control issue, but it's only from the standpoint of actually collecting any indirect costs and billing those against the grants. And in my response to, I think it was Mr. Bacon, we don't believe, and I don't believe from my evaluation of it, that we're actually losing any money, because we're using all those grants dollars against project costs, and they're capped grant amounts. So if I were to charge an indirect cost, administrative costs against it, I would have to pull in money from somewhere else to do those project features. So in this case, I don't feel like we're really losing any money. As far as going forward, we do have an option on this one to do basically a direct rate without doing cost allocation, to take essentially a 10% or a 5%. There are grants that will allow you to do a rate without going through a cost allocated rate. We have chosen to wait because we need to do cost allocation anyhow to apply it to our fee structure. It's something every city needs to really look at every 3 to 5 years, and we're due. And so because of that, I felt like it makes sense to wait on this implementation because we also need to do a cost allocation for other purposes.
Okay, makes sense. I appreciate that and so forth. And I'm not one to press to get something done quickly and so forth, that if the homework needs to go into it, then.
Yeah, thank you. This one, I just felt like we had so much going on with COVID and everything. I wanted to get it done this last fall, but it's just, there was too much on our plate.
Sure.
I appreciate your patience.
As long as the ball's rolling forward. So thank you.
Thank you.
Jeff?
Yes, sir.
Vice Chair Cooley.
Do you have some ballpark idea of the cost of hiring someone to do this? Can you find it? And is it something that we need to look at in budgeting?
Yeah.
I don't imagine it's going to be cheap.
Yeah, it's a good question. I actually think, to be honest with you, Jennifer and I both looked at it, and she's got some great contacts around the state, and I think we can get it done for under 25 grand. I do. It depends on the scope of what it is we're trying to get done. If we're trying to give them a full soup to nuts cost allocation and a rate study all the way down to the actual rates themselves for any services, it might be a little bit more than that, but I don't think we're seeing, Jennifer, weigh in if you've got a different thought, but I think 25K is kind of about what we're seeing or less.
Yeah, that's what we're seeing. And right now, there was a RFP issued not too long ago by another city who's looking for the same services. So I'm following that one along too, to see what kind of quotes they get when they go to their committees to report. And I'll be watching that carefully so we can add it into budget if necessary.
Excellent. Then one last thing, I've seen a lot of grants, and in my experience, it's very rare that they're requesting indirect cost allocations. They have an amount, a percentage, and what I've always seen is that the recipient almost always uses that amount, because who wants to give back money and they're not going to let you go over that percentage? I was a little surprised to see that flagged by the auditors in every instance.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Hearing none, we'll move on to our
Chair. Is this format workable for you? I mean, I wanted to make
absolutely
sure for you guys to digest. That work?
For me, it certainly does.
Okay.
I like this format perfectly.
Okay, wonderful.
I think from my perspective, it is too, and we have two council members here. Do you think this will answer the concerns the rest of the council members will have? I got a thumbs up from David.
Yeah,
Julio?
I agree. Okay. I think it's well put and it's well structured, straight to the point. I think it's good format.
Straightforward and very honest with where we are, Jeff. Good job.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Much appreciated. We'll move on to the next agenda item, which is future agenda items. Does anybody have anything they'd like to add?
Mr. Chair, I just have one question. Have we had any public comment or anything along the way for any of these things? Did we ask if there was public? Nicole, is there anybody hanging on the lines?
I have no written comments.
Okay.
I figured Jeff would interrupt.
Okay, I just didn't want to go by this and somebody tomorrow hangs us out to dry. I mean, it's, okay.
Yep.
I would definitely interrupt.
Thank you, Barry.
Okay.
So are there any future agenda items? Hearing none, time for the meeting review by Treasurer Giannetti.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. Two things that I would like to cover with the council next week. Will one be the recommendation that we made tonight in the discussion we had with the investment advisors. I'm really going to describe the process. I can't praise it anymore in the way it's been done now. The second time I've seen an RFP process handled like this. So my hat's off to that. And I think we made a good decision on public trust advisors as far as a recommendation. And then I'm going to review the 5 items that Jeff just mentioned. I have them here. I'm not going to go over the cash disbursement. The disbursements are fully implemented, but he still wants to track it a little bit. Payroll segregation is not fully implemented, so he needs a little more time to track it. Payroll and personnel actions. One part is done at the director's level, but the next layer down needs to be implemented. So there's a little more work to be done there. The business license, Jeff needs to establish some reports to reconcile to be able to start tracking that the process is working. And the overhead cost allocations, especially with grants, looks like we may need a consultant to help us on the allocation of those costs so we're on target. That's my report out.
Thank you very much, Treasurer Janetti. And now for the Finance Director's comments, Mr. Mullenkamp.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair Committee. We've been busy in finance. We just kicked off the audit last week, or not the audit. I got audit on my mind. We're done with the audit. We kicked off the budget this last week, and so we're starting to really go ahead. The departments are now in budget building process. We at the budget at the finance level are looking at the revenues and starting to kind of look and try and get our best estimates as to what that's going to look like going forward. So I got a lot of staff time, including my own, looking at the budget now. So it's a busy time, and it'll just get busier as we get into March and April. We're planning on taking the first draft of the budget to the city council in April. So we'll be working through the numbers. We're hopeful. We started off with the gangbusters last year and then COVID hit. So I'm kind of planning on not having that this year and having a regular budget process. In addition to that, we are, we're mowing through the accounts payable. We're continuing to make some improvements there. Jennifer and I have been working on some internal service funds that the city council approved a little while back. Those will be new elements into the budget this year. And this is for our purchasing of vehicles, equipment, our building maintenance process. We're moving into the next generation of budgeting for the city, which is really exciting to me. And so I'm really excited about that because it'll give the city council, finance committee, city council, ultimately the ability to see not just the operating costs of running government, but those extended costs out to maintaining what we own and replacing what we need to replace. And so we're working on that. We're going to get a good part of it implemented this budget year. There may be some small elements we can't get done this year. I'll be talking to staff and city manager about that, about how far we can get. We want to do it right, not fast, as a couple committee members have mentioned. But I feel excited about it. It's one of these things that moves the city forward, and those are always the things like we did tonight with the investment advice and that process. These are things that move us forward and move us into the next level. So with that, I'll be happy to bring the next set of financials to you next month and let you know how we're doing, which is good, actually.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair, I got a quick question.
Yes.
So does the committee review the budget on a quarterly basis? So for example, where I came from, the San Diego and Pass Water Agency, our budget was quite simple. So each month, the committee members, we would review almost a line by line, item detail of, okay, if we're 1/4 of the way into the year, or do we have 75% remaining in that budget? Or if something is only paid once or twice a year, what's remaining? Does the committee go through that process at least on a quarterly basis of the budget that's currently, in place?
Yeah, that's a great question. The chair and I had a discussion about this, but through emails on Friday, actually. We do. The only reason I didn't bring it, we actually do monthly for the 2 major operating funds. So the major operating fund that covers the vast majority of city operations is the general fund. And that includes, all your police operations, all your streets and all those kinds of operations from an operational standpoint. I bring those monthly to the committee. The only reason I didn't bring it is just we're kind of early in the month and I didn't quite have January ready yet because I didn't have all the payroll posted into the general ledger. It's been paid. But we'll do that monthly for both those two major funds. If the committee wants to see anything other than that, balances of any kind of nature of where we are with certain types of funds, we can provide that as well. But we usually have been focusing on the wastewater fund and the general fund, which are two major operations.
Okay, all right, very good. Just getting a better, clearer picture of the committee's roles and what gets done on a monthly basis. So very good, thank you.
Do we have any other questions? All right, hearing none. Nicole, I wanted to confirm something with you. Historically, as I recall, with Robert's Rules of Order, there needs to be a motion to adjourn. Am I mistaken, or is that correct?
Historically, we have not done that. I can look
Okay.
into it and we can do that for future.
All right.
Don't forget, we don't follow Robert's rules. We follow the Rosenberg rules.
Oh, yes,
All right.
that's correct.
Rules of order.
All right. Thank you, Councilmember Martinez. If there is no objection, then we will call this meeting adjourned at 7:19 p.m. Our next meeting will be Monday, March 8th, 2021 at 6 p.m.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night. Have a good one.